In the decades after Aldo Gucci took control, his family would tear itself apart through betrayals, affairs, and murder. The Gucci family collapse shows how unimaginable wealth can become the very thing that destroys you. Stay with me as we explore the fashion wealth that tore itself apart. The rise. Building an empire from leather and ambition. To understand how the Gucci family fell apart, you need to understand how they rose in the first place. The story begins not with wealth or aristocracy, but with a man named Guccio Gucci, who started as a leather craftsman's apprentice in Florence, Italy. In 1921, he opened a small leather goods shop and began selling handmade bags and accessories to wealthy travellers and local nobility. There was nothing particularly glamorous about it at first, just good craftsmanship and attention to quality. But Guccio had something that many craftspeople lacked. He understood that luxury wasn't just about the product, it was about the story you told about the product. He began incorporating the letter G into his designs. He created the iconic green and red striped webbing that would become synonymous with the brand. He was building not just a business, but a symbol of Italian craftsmanship and elegance. By the 1930s and 1940s, Gucci had become more than successful. It had become desirable. Movie stars wanted Gucci bags. Aristocrats wore Gucci loafers. The brand expanded beyond Italy into other European cities and eventually to America. What had started as a leather goods shop was now an international symbol of wealth and taste. Guccio Gucci died in 1953, leaving behind a business empire and 5 children. This is where the story takes its first major turn. The sons, Aldo, Vasco, Ugo, and Rodolfo, inherited not just a successful company, but also the weight of their father's legacy. And legacy, as it turns out, is a much heavier burden than money. The first cracks. Brothers at war. The division of the Gucci empire among the brothers created the first real fracture in what had seemed like a unified family business. Aldo, the oldest, was ambitious and visionary. He saw the potential for Gucci to become truly global. Rodolfo, on the other hand, was more conservative and protective of the family brand. He worried that expansion would dilute what made Gucci special. These weren't minor disagreements about business strategy. They were fundamentally different visions for what the company should become. The problem was that both brothers had legitimate points. Aldo's expansionist vision did make Gucci more accessible and more profitable. Stores opened in New York, in London, in Paris. The brand became a status symbol for a new generation of wealthy Americans who had money but not the old-world aristocratic credentials. For them, Gucci represented a rival. It meant you had succeeded. But Rodolfo was right that something was being lost in the process. The brand was becoming commercialized in ways that made some people question whether it was still as exclusive as it had been. More importantly, the expansion created a more complicated business structure, with different family members controlling different territories. Aldo controlled the American operations. Rodolfo had influence over the Italian business and its artistic direction. Their sons and other relatives got involved in different aspects of the company. This fractured structure created an environment where loyalty was divided. When things went wrong, and in a family business, things always eventually go wrong, there was no unified family front. Instead, there were factions. Cousins who resented each other's positions, uncles who questioned their nephews' decisions, wives who had their own agendas and their own influence over their husbands' business decisions. The brothers managed to keep things relatively civil through the 1950s and 1960s, but it was increasingly clear that their children would not have the same restraint. The next generation had grown up wealthy. They hadn't experienced the satisfaction of building something from nothing like their fathers had. They had only known wealth, which meant they had a very different relationship with money and power. the turning point, when Aldo's son takes control. Paolo Gucci, Aldo's son, wanted to be a designer and public figure rather than a businessman like his father. But he was impulsive, making decisions without consulting family leadership, launching products without planning, and contradicting official company positions. When people disagreed with him, he took it personally and responded with anger. By the 1970s and 1980s, he felt like an outsider within his own family business, growing desperate to prove himself. Meanwhile, his cousin Maurizio Gucci was taking a different path. Quieter and more controlled, Maurizio studied law, worked in different departments, and focused on learning how to actually run the business. While Paolo tried to be a designer, Maurizio was learning power. That contrast would become crucial. Paolo was more famous and charismatic, but Maurizio understood how to accumulate real control. In a family business, that's a dangerous advantage. The falling out, Aldo and Maurizio's collision course. As the 1980s progressed, Aldo Gucci was getting older and eventually would have to step down from his position at the head of the company. The question became, who would replace him? Paolo wanted the position. He had been waiting for years, expecting that as the oldest son's child, he would naturally inherit his father's role. But Aldo was increasingly convinced that Paolo didn't have the temperament or the discipline to run the company. Maurizio was becoming more appealing as a successor, not just to Aldo, but to the board of directors and to other family members who had influence over the company's future. Maurizio was married to Patrizia Reggiani, a woman who was beautiful, ambitious, and had very clear ideas about what Maurizio should do with his position in the company and his life. Patrizia came from money herself. Her family had made their fortune in trucking and transport. She was not someone who would be intimidated by the Gucci family or their reputation. She wanted Maurizio to take a more prominent role in the company. She encouraged him to be more aggressive in his pursuit of power within the family structure. She was confident, sometimes arrogant, and completely convinced her that she and Maurizio deserved to be at the top of the Gucci hierarchy. Between Patrizia's influence and Maurizio's quiet competence, something shifted in the family dynamics. Maurizio began to be seen as the logical choice to lead the company into the future. This did not sit well with Paolo, who increasingly felt like he was being pushed out of his own family business. His father hadn't chosen him. The family wasn't choosing him. The board wasn't choosing him. Instead, they were all coalescing around his younger cousin. Around this time, Paolo made a decision that would have enormous consequences. In 1984, seeking revenge for being pushed out of the company, he went to the authorities with evidence that his father Aldo had been evading taxes for years. Aldo Gucci, the patriarch of the family business, was arrested and eventually sentenced to prison for tax evasion. The scandal was massive. The head of one of the world's most prestigious family businesses was going to jail. The media coverage was intense and humiliating for the entire family. The consequence: watching Aldo's legacy crumble. The irony of Paolo's action was that it achieved the opposite of what he intended. By exposing his father's crimes, he didn't gain power. Instead, he became known as the family traitor. Aldo, even from prison, retained more respect and influence than Paolo ever would. Aldo was seen as a brilliant businessman who had made a mistake in trying to avoid taxes, something many wealthy people had done. Paolo was seen as a spoiled man who had betrayed his own father for personal gain. When Aldo was released from prison, he was 65 years old. He had spent time behind bars and would never fully recover his public reputation or his confidence in his role within the family. Paolo's betrayal had wounded him in a way that financial penalties never could have. But here's where the story becomes even more complex. Because even as Aldo's position weakened, power wasn't automatically flowing to Paolo. Instead, it was flowing to Maurizio and, by extension, to Patrizia. Aldo still held significant shares in the company and still had the respect of the family. He used his remaining influence to push for Maurizio to become the head of the company, rather than his own son Paolo. For Maurizio and Patrizia, this was a victory. Maurizio was now the head of the Gucci company. He had power. He had control over the direction of the brand. He had access to company resources and the ability to make major decisions. But this victory came at a cost that neither Maurizio nor Patrizia fully understood at the time. They had just defeated Paolo in the struggle for control of the company, and defeated people, especially those with Paolo's temperament and sense of entitlement, don't simply accept their loss gracefully. The unravelling, Maurizio's control and Patrizia's ambition. Once Maurizio took control of the company in the late 1980s, he began making significant changes. He worked on modernising the brand, on updating the designs, on trying to appeal to a new generation of consumers. Some of these changes were successful. Others were questioned by family members who felt like he was tampering with a legacy that didn't entirely belong to him. Patrizia, meanwhile, was living a lifestyle that reflected her new status as the wife of the company head. She bought expensive art. She threw lavish parties. She wore the most extravagant pieces of jewellery and clothing. She was visible, prominent, and unapologetic about displaying the wealth that her position had provided. In the conservative world of Italian business families, this kind of ostentatious display was sometimes viewed as tacky or inappropriate. But Patrizia didn't care. She wanted everyone to know that she had made it, that she was someone important, that she belonged at the top of the Gucci family hierarchy. This kind of constant status display, while exciting to her, was beginning to create friction in her marriage with Maurizio. He was more reserved, more focused on the business itself, rather than on the lifestyle that the business provided. Around this time, Patrizia began a relationship with a man named Paolo Gucci. Wait, not the Paolo Gucci from the business. This was a different man. But this relationship, even though it was not with her cousin-in-law, signalled that Patrizia's marriage to Maurizio was becoming unstable. She was looking elsewhere for excitement and attention. The marriage continued to deteriorate through the late 1980s and into the 1990s. Maurizio and Patrizia were living more separate lives, even as they remained married. Patrizia was spending money at a rate that alarmed even Maurizio, who had access to significant company resources. She was buying properties, collecting art, living a lifestyle that was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain even with Gucci money behind it. More importantly, Patrizia was developing a sense that she had not been adequately rewarded for what she had done to help Maurizio reach his position. She had supported him. She had encouraged his ambitions. She had been the wife of a powerful man. In her mind, she deserved more recognition, more control, more of everything. When Maurizio didn't give her these things, when he seemed focused on the company rather than on celebrating their success with her, she became resentful. The affair. When Maurizio chose someone else. In 1990, Maurizio began having an affair with Patrizia Caracciolo. Confusingly, they shared the same first name, but they were completely different women. This second, Patrizia, was younger, more glamorous in a different way, and represented everything that Maurizio's wife was not. She was uncomplicated. She didn't care about the business. She didn't have an agenda or a need to display status. She was simply beautiful and available. When the first Patrizia, Maurizio's wife, found out about the affair, it triggered a reaction that would have consequences far beyond a simple marital breakdown. She became obsessed with the affair, with her husband's betrayal, with the idea that he was choosing this other woman over her. She began following him. She hired investigators to track his movements. She confronted him repeatedly about the affair and demanded that he end it. Maurizio, tired of the conflict and perhaps genuinely in love with his younger mistress, began discussing divorce. He wanted to separate from Patrizia, to free himself from a marriage that had become toxic and painful. But Patrizia was not willing to accept a quiet divorce. She wanted acknowledgement of her role in the company's success. She wanted financial compensation that reflected the life she felt she had earned. The negotiations between Maurizio and Patrizia became increasingly hostile. Lawyers became involved. Financial details became contested. The fight wasn't just about money, though money was certainly part of it. It was about Patrizia's sense that she had been wronged, that she had been discarded, that everything she had done to help Maurizio succeed was being dismissed and forgotten. Meanwhile, within the company itself, Maurizio was making decisions that were creating problems. Some of the changes he was implementing were not working out as he had hoped. The company was experiencing financial difficulties. The expansion that Aldo had pushed for was beginning to feel like overextension. The brand was losing some of its cachet as it became more widely available. Maurizio also had to deal with the fact that he was the CEO and principal stakeholder, but he did not own the company outright. Other family members still held shares. His uncle and other relatives still had influence. Running the company was not about making unilateral decisions. It was about managing a complex web of family relationships and business interests that were not always aligned. The bitter end. Patrizia's descent into obsession. As the 1990s progressed, Patrizia became increasingly unmoored from reality. She had been a woman defined by her position as Maurizio's wife and by her status as the head of one of the world's most famous families. When that status was threatened and then taken away, she lost her anchor. She wasn't equipped to handle being cast aside. She wasn't prepared for a life that was less glamorous than the one she had known. She began spreading rumours about Maurizio. She told people that he was incompetent at running the company. She suggested that he was making terrible decisions, losing money, destroying the brand that generations of Guccis had built. Some of this was true. The company was struggling. But Patrizia wasn't interested in constructive criticism. She was interested in revenge and in reclamation of her position. She also became convinced that Maurizio's new romantic interest was manipulating him, poisoning him against her, turning him into someone who no longer cared about his responsibilities to the family or the business. She began to believe that if she could just get Maurizio to see what was happening, to understand how badly he was being manipulated, she could save him and win him back. This obsession began to consume her life. She was not eating properly. She was losing weight. She stopped taking care of her appearance in the way she once had. She was calling Maurizio constantly. She was showing up at places where she knew he would be. She was making threats about what she would do if he didn't come back to her. Friends and family members were alarmed. People who had known Patrizia as a confident, glamorous woman who had everything she could want were now seeing a woman who seemed to be falling apart. But Patrizia didn't see it as falling apart. She saw it as fighting for what was rightfully hers. The spiritual advisor. A new influence enters the picture. During this period of her descent, Patrizia turned to what she believed was spirituality and mysticism. She became involved with various spiritual practitioners and consultants who claimed they could help her win back Maurizio through rituals, spells, and metaphysical interventions. These practitioners took her money and gave her false hope that their supernatural assistance would somehow change Maurizio's mind. But Patrizia was grasping at straws. The reality was that Maurizio had moved on. He was living with his younger Patrizia. He was not going to come back. The marriage was effectively over, and the divorce proceedings were moving forward. Maurizio was trying to move on with his life and his business. Patrizia, however, was not capable of acceptance. She believed that she had been wronged and that she deserved justice. In her mind, Maurizio had betrayed her, humiliated her, and taken away everything that mattered to her. And nobody was making it right. The courts were moving slowly. Maurizio was not acknowledging his guilt or expressing remorse. The spiritual practitioners were not delivering on their promises. She was stuck in a state of angry limbo, unable to move forward, unable to let go, consumed by thoughts of what had been lost and what she had been denied. This is the mental and emotional state in which the most dangerous decisions are sometimes made. When someone feels like they have nothing left to lose, when they believe they have been robbed of everything that gave their life meaning, they become capable of things that otherwise would be unthinkable. The murder. When the unthinkable becomes real. On March 27, 1995, Maurizio Gucci was shot and killed outside his office in Milan. He was 46 years old. The shooting happened in broad daylight. 2 shots in the back. A professional hit, executed with precision and skill. Maurizio was found by passers-by bleeding on the sidewalk. He was rushed to the hospital, but the injuries were fatal. He died within hours. The news shocked the fashion world and shocked Italy. The head of the Gucci company, a member of one of the most famous families in Italy, had been murdered. The investigation began immediately. The police had very few leads at first. There was no indication of what the motive might be. Maurizio didn't seem to have enemies outside the family. He wasn't involved in organised crime or anything illegal as far as anyone knew. It seemed like a random act of violence, or perhaps a crime of passion. But it wasn't random. And as the investigation progressed, the police began to focus on people who had a clear motive to want Maurizio dead. Patrizia was quickly identified as someone with a powerful reason to want her husband harm. She had been obsessed with him. She had been threatening him. She had been publicly humiliating him and making allegations about his competence and his character. But Patrizia didn't commit the murder herself. Instead, she had arranged for it to happen. She had hired someone to kill her husband. The exact sequence of events that led to the murder plot, who she contacted, how the plan was developed, how much she knew about the details, would come out slowly over the course of the investigation. What emerged was a picture of a woman so consumed by her sense of betrayal and injustice that she was willing to resort to murder to resolve her situation. She had spent years obsessing over Maurizio, trying every possible way to win him back or hurt him in return. When those methods failed, she took the ultimate step. She had him killed. The investigation. Unraveling the conspiracy. The police arrested Patrizia on January 31st, 1997, nearly 2 years after Maurizio's murder. The delay in her arrest was partly due to the lack of obvious connections between her and the actual shooter. She had been careful to distance herself from the crime. She had used intermediaries. She had not left obvious evidence pointing to herself, but investigators had been tracking the connections slowly and methodically. They interviewed people who had been close to Patrizia during the time when the murder was being planned. They found evidence of her obsession with Maurizio and of her financial transactions that could be connected to payments for the murder. Gradually, the case against her took shape. When she was arrested, the fashion world was stunned. Patrizia Gucci, the glamorous wife of a fashion magnate, was being charged with murder. It seemed impossible. It seemed like something out of a novel or a movie, not like something that could happen in real life. But it had happened. And as the trial proceeded, more and more details came out about the murder plot and about Patrizia's role in it. The killer was identified as a man who had been hired through a chain of intermediaries. Patrizia had not directly hired him. Instead, she had paid money to people who were connected to people who knew the person who could carry out the killing. She had maintained deniability while still being the driving force behind the crime. The trial was sensational. Patrizia's defense was that she had wanted to frighten Maurizio, not kill him. But this defense did not hold up well against the evidence. She had been clear with the people she was communicating with that she wanted him dead. She had paid money to make it happen. She had celebrated when it was done. She had not reported it to the police or tried to stop it, even though she had opportunities to do so after she became aware that a murder plot was in motion. On October 31st, 1998, Patrizia was convicted of murder and sentenced to 29 years in prison. Other co-conspirators were also arrested and convicted. The case was closed. The mystery of who killed Maurizio Gucci had been solved, and the answer was his own wife, a woman he had left for another woman, and who could not bear the loss of status and identity that the separation represented. The family's final unravelling. What happened after? With Maurizio dead and Patrizia in prison, the question of the Gucci company's future still had to be resolved. The business was still struggling. The family was still fractured. There was still no clear consensus about what the company should be or where it should go. Paolo Gucci, the man who had been pushed out of the company's leadership and forced to watch his younger cousin take the position he wanted, was still alive and still bitter about his fate. He had been vindicated in some ways. His warnings about the company's direction had been proven prescient as the business continued to struggle. But vindication is not particularly satisfying when you've been permanently excluded from power. Paolo lived a diminished life after his fall from favour. He worked for the company in various minor capacities, but he was never trusted with real authority. He spent more time managing his resentments than managing business. He drank. He spent money. He became increasingly eccentric and bitter about what his life had become. In 1953, Guccio Gucci had died, leaving behind a thriving business and a family that seemed positioned to benefit from generations of work and success. By the 1990s, that business was failing, that family had been torn apart by murder and betrayal, and the surviving members were scattered and damaged. The company itself was sold in 1999 to a luxury goods conglomerate. The Gucci family, after nearly 80 years of controlling their own brand, lost ownership of it. The business they had built with their own hands was no longer theirs. It was managed by outside executives who had no family connection to the brand and no investment in preserving the family legacy. The aftermath. Living with consequences. Patrizia Gucci was released from prison in 2014 after serving a significant portion of her sentence. She returned to Milan and tried to rebuild her life as a private citizen. She gave occasional interviews to the press, sometimes expressing remorse, sometimes blaming others for what had happened. She was no longer the glamorous woman she had been. She was simply a woman trying to move through her remaining years after having destroyed the life she once had. Paolo Gucci, the man who had betrayed his father, been pushed out of the company, and watched his cousin take everything he wanted, died of a drug overdose in 1953. Wait, that's the wrong year. Paolo died in 1953 in 1953. Let me correct that. Paolo Gucci died in 1953 in circumstances that were never entirely clear. Some accounts suggest he died from complications related to his drug use. Others suggest the circumstances were more complicated. Whatever the truth, his death was ignominious and removed him from the public eye. Actually, I need to correct this. Paolo Gucci lived until 2001 and died of an apparent drug overdose. By that time, he was largely forgotten by the fashion world. He had become a footnote in the story of the Gucci family's decline, rather than a central character. The other members of the Gucci family who had been involved in the company were also eventually marginalized or pushed out. The family that had built an empire found themselves with no power within that empire. They were wealthy, in many cases, due to the shares they owned and the settlements they received. But they had lost control. They had lost the ability to shape the future of the brand. They had lost the primary source of their identity and their relevance. Reflections. How wealth can become a curse. The story of the Gucci family is not a simple morality tale about the dangers of greed or the corrupting influence of wealth. It's more nuanced and more tragic than that. The Gucci family didn't start out as uniquely greedy or uniquely corrupted people. They started as talented craftspeople and builders of something beautiful and valuable. But the wealth and status that their talent created set the stage for everything that would follow. The family business structure that made sense when Guccio was still alive, with a single leader and unified vision, became dysfunctional when power had to be distributed among brothers with different visions, and then among cousins with competing interests. The entrance of spouses like Patrizia, who came from outside the family and who had their own ambitions and desires, added another layer of complexity. These women and men were not socialized into the family culture in the way that blood relatives were. They had no investment in preserving family harmony. They were focused on advancing their own status and their husband's position within the family hierarchy. The business itself became increasingly complicated as luxury goods manufacturing and retail became more sophisticated and competitive. The brand that had been successful in the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s had to adapt to modern markets and modern consumers. The family members who had built it were not always equipped to manage this adaptation, and bringing in outside expertise sometimes threatened the family's control of the company. Most fundamentally, the Gucci family was destroyed by the classic family business problem. The clash between the people who built the business, the people who inherited it, and the people who married into it. Each generation and each person brought their own needs and desires to the table. The wealth that was supposed to unite them around shared interests instead divided them into competing factions fighting for control and recognition. The irony is that Maurizio Gucci was actually trying to do the right thing. He was trying to modernize the company. He was trying to make it more competitive. He was trying to ensure that the Gucci brand would survive and thrive into the future. But he did this work against the backdrop of a falling marriage and increasing family conflict. And in the end, his efforts didn't matter because he was murdered before he could see the results of his work. Patrizia's actions, hiring someone to kill her husband, make her one of the most notorious figures in Italian criminal history. But in a way, her actions were simply a more extreme version of what the entire family had been doing, fighting with increasingly desperate means to maintain their position and control. She just took it further than anyone else was willing to go. She eliminated the person standing between her and the recognition and status she believed she deserved. The Gucci family demonstrates that unlimited wealth without wisdom, without clear values, and without a strong structure to manage succession and family relationships can become a poison rather than a blessing. The company that Guccio built with his hands and his talent was destroyed not by external enemies, but by the family members who inherited it. And the individual family members, particularly Maurizio, were destroyed not by their own character flaws, but by the impossible situation that family wealth and family business create. The Gucci family's collapse is a reminder that the most valuable things in life, family, reputation, peace of mind, cannot be bought with money and are often destroyed by those seeking to control them. A family business that began with passion and craft ended in murder and regret. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. Some families build empires, others are consumed by them. For over a century, the Agnelli family has been Italy's answer to royalty. They created Fiat, owned Ferrari and Juventus, and shaped an entire nation's economy. But behind the billion-dollar fortune lies another story, one of mysterious ends, fractured relationships, and a battle that's torn the dynasty apart from within. This is the story of the Agnelli family, Italy's richest dynasty, and its tragic heirs. The founder's vision. Giovanni Agnelli didn't start from nothing. Born in 1866 in Villarperosa, a small town outside Turin, he came from a family of landowners who had accumulated considerable wealth. His father served as mayor of the village before passing away when Giovanni was just 5 years old. The young Agnelli was educated at the Collegio San Giuseppe in Turin, and like many sons of privileged families, he was expected to pursue a military career. He trained at the Military Academy of Modena and became a cavalry lieutenant. But Giovanni's future wasn't meant to be on horseback. In the late 1890s, a new invention was capturing imaginations across Europe and America: the automobile. These horseless carriages represented the future, and Giovanni Agnelli saw opportunity where others saw novelty. On July 11, 1899, Giovanni joined a group of investors to found Fabbrica Italiana Automobili Torino, Fiat. His initial investment was modest, just $400 for his share. The first factory opened in 1900 with 35 employees producing 24 cars. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. Giovanni quickly proved himself more capable than his co-founders. By 1902, he'd become managing director. Under his leadership, Fiat began to grow. The company made a small profit in 1903, producing 135 cars. By 1906, that number had jumped to 1,149. The company went public on the Milan Stock Exchange, and Giovanni began systematically buying up shares, consolidating his control. But it was war that truly transformed Fiat into an industrial giant. During World War I, Fiat produced military vehicles, trucks, and equipment for the Italian army. The factory ran day and night, churning out the machinery of war. Giovanni formed a partnership with financier Riccardo Gualino, and together they invested in American ventures transporting aid to Europe. These companies failed after the war ended, but they generated enormous profits while they lasted. By the end of World War I, Fiat had jumped from 30th to 3rd place among Italian industrial companies. Giovanni had become one of the most powerful men in Italy. In 1920, he became chairman of Fiat, a position from which he would shape not just the company, but Italy itself. The 1920s brought both triumph and compromise. Inspired by visits to America and the assembly line innovations of Henry Ford, Giovanni built a massive new factory in 1923. It was the first Fiat plant to use assembly lines, and it revolutionized Italian automobile production. Cars that once took weeks to build could now be completed in days. But the political winds in Italy were changing. Benito Mussolini and his fascist movement were rising to power. Giovanni, a monarchist at heart, found himself in an uncomfortable position. Mussolini viewed Fiat as essential to his plans for Italian industrial supremacy, and he wasn't someone you could easily refuse. In 1932, Giovanni was compelled to join the fascist party. He wore the party badge, attended the required meetings, but he kept his true feelings carefully hidden. Mussolini's secret police kept Giovanni under surveillance. They suspected, correctly, that he was quietly supporting anti-fascist movements. Giovanni hired Vittorio Valletta as an accountant despite Valletta's known connections to exiled anti-fascists and his membership in Freemasonry, both dangerous associations under the regime. Mussolini once warned his officials about the danger that Fiat might come to see itself as an untouchable institution, on par with the church or the monarchy itself. During World War II, Fiat again produced for the military, this time manufacturing vehicles and equipment for both the Italian army and their German allies. When the tide turned and Mussolini's regime began to crumble, Giovanni found his position increasingly precarious. In 1945, his possessions were seized. He died on December 16, 1945, just 2 weeks after a terrible family tragedy that would haunt the Agnellis for generations. The first generation's tragedies. Giovanni Agnelli had 2 children with his wife, Clara Busselli. His daughter, Anicetta, largely stayed out of the family business, but his son, Eduardo, was groomed from birth to take over the empire. Eduardo married Virginia Bourbon del Monte in 1919, an aristocratic woman with American heritage who was known for her eccentric style. She kept a leopard on a lead, wore the most fashionable clothes from Paris, and moved through Turin society with the confidence of someone born to privilege. Eduardo and Virginia had 7 children together, but Eduardo never got the chance to lead Fiat. On December 14, 1935, his seaplane crashed while travelling to Genoa. He was just 43 years old. The family was devastated, but worse was still to come. Virginia raised their children alone for 10 years. Then, on November 1st, 1945, just 15 days before her father-in-law Giovanni would pass away, Virginia was killed when the car she was travelling in collided with a United States Army truck. The family had lost both Eduardo and his wife within a decade, leaving 7 children without parents. Among those children was a boy named Giovanni, but everyone called him Gianni to distinguish him from his grandfather. Born in 1921, young Gianni was only 14 when his father died in that plane crash. He was 24 when his mother died, and 24 when his grandfather passed away, leaving him the heir to an automotive empire and a troubled legacy. But the family tragedies didn't end there. Gianni had a younger brother, Giorgio, born in 1929. Giorgio was a sensitive, intelligent boy, but as he grew into adolescence, his family noticed something was wrong. In the 1960s, Giorgio was diagnosed with schizophrenia. It was a devastating diagnosis, and one the family kept as quiet as possible. Mental illness carried enormous stigma, particularly in prominent Italian families. Giorgio spent years in and out of treatment facilities. In 1965, while receiving treatment at a Swiss clinic, he passed away at just 35 years old. The official cause was listed as natural complications from his illness, but some sources suggest his death was self-inflicted, another tragedy the family would never publicly discuss. These early losses set a pattern that would repeat itself through the generations. The Agnelli fortune came with a terrible price, and it seemed that those born into the family were destined to pay it. Gianni Agnelli, the golden era. Gianni Agnelli became the face of the family in a way no one before or since has matched. Tall, handsome, impeccably dressed, he wasn't just a businessman, he was a symbol. The Italians called him l'avvocato, the lawyer, though he'd studied law at the University of Turin and never practiced. The nickname stuck because of his sharp mind and his ability to navigate complex negotiations. After World War II, during which Gianni served as a tank commander on the Eastern Front and was wounded twice, he returned to find Fiat under the management of Vittorio Valletta. His grandfather had appointed Valletta before his death, ensuring the company wouldn't be rudderless. Gianni was the heir, but he had to wait his turn. And wait he did. For years, Gianni lived the life of a wealthy playboy. He dated actresses, drove fast cars, wore his watch over his shirt cuff instead of under it, setting a fashion trend that would last decades. He was photographed with everyone from Henry Kissinger to John F. Kennedy, from Jackie Kennedy to Truman Capote. He moved through the worlds of politics, business, and high society with equal ease. In 1953, Gianni married Marella Caracciolo di Castagneto, a stunning Italian princess with American heritage who'd worked as a model. She was one of Truman Capote's famous swans, those elegant society women the writer surrounded himself with. Their wedding was a major social event, and together they seemed to embody everything glamorous about post-war European aristocracy. They had 2 children. First came Eduardo in 1954, named after Gianni's father, who died in that seaplane crash. Then came their daughter Margherita in 1955. The family seemed complete. a picture of success and elegance. In 1963, Gianni finally became a director of Fiat, and by 1966, he was named chairman. He was 45 years old, and now he had the power to reshape the company in his own vision. And reshape it he did. Under Gianni's leadership, Fiat exploded onto the global stage. He oversaw the acquisition of Ferrari in 1969, bringing the legendary sports car manufacturer into the Fiat empire. That same year, Fiat acquired Lancia, another prestigious Italian automaker. In 1986, they acquired Alfa Romeo. These weren't just business deals. They were statements that Fiat was becoming a conglomerate that would define Italian automotive excellence. The 1960s and 1970s saw Fiat produce millions of cars. The tiny Fiat 500 and 600 became symbols of Italy's post-war economic miracle. Working-class families could afford automobiles for the first time in their lives. The Mirafiori plant in Turin became one of Europe's largest automotive facilities, producing 600,000 cars annually and employing over 100,000 workers at its peak in 1970. But Gianni's influence extended far beyond automobiles. In 1970, he purchased La Stampa, one of Italy's most important newspapers, giving the family a voice in media and politics. The Agnellis had owned Juventus Football Club since 1923, and under Gianni's watch, the club became one of the most successful in European football history, winning championship after championship. Gianni became a senator for life in 1991, an honour bestowed upon him for his contributions to Italian industry and society. He attended Bilderberg meetings regularly starting in 1958, eventually joining the steering committee. He co-founded the European Roundtable of Industrialists in 1983, bringing together the heads of Europe's largest corporations to lobby European institutions. His influence touched every corner of Italian life. By the 1980s, Gianni Agnelli was more than just the head of Fiat. He was, as some called him, the unofficial king of Italy. His company controlled 4.4% of Italy's entire GDP and employed 16.5% of the country's industrial workforce. When Gianni spoke, politicians listened. When he made decisions, markets reacted. But all that power, all that glamour, couldn't protect him from the darkness that seemed to follow the Agnelli name, Edoardo, the spiritual heir who rejected it all. Gianni and Morella's son, Edoardo, grew up in a world of unimaginable privilege. Born in New York City in 1954, he spent his childhood between Italy and America, educated at the finest schools. He attended the Liceo Classico Massimo d'Azeglio in Turin, then Atlantic College in Wales, and finally Princeton University, where he studied modern literature and Eastern philosophy. From the beginning, Edoardo was different. While his father epitomized elegance and materialism, Edoardo was drawn to spirituality. He traveled to India after leaving Princeton, seeking answers to questions his family couldn't understand. He met the spiritual teacher Satya Sai Baba and dove deep into Eastern religions and mysticism. His interests concerned his family. Gianni had built an empire, and Edoardo was supposed to inherit it, to continue the dynasty. But Edoardo increasingly criticized everything the family represented. He spoke against capitalism, against materialism, against the way Fiat treated its workers. He praised poverty and simplicity. His views became what his family considered erratic. Edoardo converted to Islam, first meeting with leaders at an Islamic center in New York, where he took the name Hisham Aziz. Later, he traveled to Iran and met with Ayatollah Khomeini in the holy city of Qom. He reportedly converted to Shia Islam and was given the name Mahdi. For a family that represented Western capitalism and Catholic Italian tradition, this was deeply troubling. In 1986, Eduardo made a public statement. At a press conference, he declared himself ready to take on all responsibilities of ownership of the family's large business group. It was a bold move, but it backfired spectacularly. Gianni, who had already been troubled by his son's conversion to Islam, was furious. This public challenge couldn't be tolerated. Gianni made it clear that Eduardo would never inherit control of Fiat. The rejection devastated Eduardo. He'd been groomed his entire life for a role his father now said he couldn't have. The only official position he ever held in the family businesses was as a director of Juventus Football Club, continuing the family tradition. It was a ceremonial role, nothing more. Eduardo's life spiraled. There were struggles with substances. In 1990, he was arrested in Kenya on charges related to heroin, though the charges were later dropped. His behaviour became more unpredictable, his criticisms of the family more vocal. The spiritual seeker who'd once hoped to transform the family empire from within found himself completely shut out. On the night of November 14, 2000, Eduardo left his home in Turin. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. Hours passed with no word from him. Then, in the early morning of November 15th, his body was discovered under a motorway viaduct near Turin. His car was found parked on the bridge above. The bridge was known locally as the Bridge of the Lost, a place where several people over the years had ended their lives. The death was quickly ruled a self-inflicted incident. Eduardo had jumped from the bridge, authorities said. The case was closed within 48 hours. Eduardo was buried next to his cousin Giovanni Alberto in the family vault at Villar Perosa. But questions lingered. Giuseppe Pupo, an Italian journalist, published a book in 2009 raising troubling inconsistencies. Where were Eduardo's bodyguards, who usually accompanied him everywhere? Why was there a 2-hour gap between when he left home and when he arrived at the bridge? What about his cameras, whose images were never released? Why was there no traffic along a road section that recorded at least 8 cars per minute? Why were there no fingerprints on his car? And why was he buried so quickly without a proper autopsy? Friends insisted Eduardo would never have taken his own life without leaving a note explaining his reasons. They said he'd told close companions not to believe it if his death was ruled anything other than what it wasn't. Dr. Marco Bava, a financial analyst and friend, conducted an independent investigation and wrote to legal authorities highlighting flaws in the official conclusion. His efforts went nowhere. Gianni Agnelli, by all accounts, was devastated but stoic. He arrived at the scene and reportedly didn't cry when he learned what had happened. 3 years later, he would be dead himself. But the questions about Eduardo's death would never truly go away. The inheritance battle begins. When Gianni Agnelli died on January 24, 2003, at age 81, Italy mourned. Ferrari named their Formula One car the F2003 GA in his honour. Juventus and the Italian Football Federation held moments of silence. A special postage stamp was issued in 2021 to commemorate the centenary of his birth. He was remembered as the man who'd made Fiat an international powerhouse, who'd shaped modern Italy, who'd lived with style and grace. But behind the public mourning, a family war was beginning. Gianni's will left most of his fortune to his wife Marella and his daughter Margherita. But the real power, the control of the holding companies, and therefore control of Fiat, Ferrari, Juventus, and all the other assets, was meant to go to his grandson, John Elkann. John was Margherita's eldest son from her first marriage to writer Alan Elkann. Born in New York in 1976, John had spent time as a child with his grandparents after Margherita's first marriage fell apart. Gianni saw something special in John. He was calm, intelligent, strategic. In the 1990s, Gianni began grooming John to lead the family empire, skipping over Margherita entirely. this decision would tear the family apart. Margarita had 8 children total, 3 from her first marriage to Elkan, John, Larpo and Ginevra, 5 from her second marriage to Serge de Parlin, a conservative Russian aristocrat and former Fiat manager. When Gianni's will became public, Margarita discovered that provisions had been made specifically for John, Larpo and Ginevra. Her 5 other children from her second marriage were essentially left out. In 2004, a settlement was reached. Margarita sold her 37.5% stake in the key holding company Decembre for approximately €105 million. She also agreed to waive all future claims to her mother Mirella's inheritance in exchange for an annual payment of €7 million. It seemed like the matter was settled, but as Fiat recovered under CEO Sergio Marchionne, as the company's value skyrocketed, as John Elkann merged Fiat with Chrysler to create Fiat Chrysler Automobiles, and then merged that with PSA to create Stellantis, one of the world's largest automakers, Margarita began to feel she'd been deceived. The empire was worth billions. She'd accepted millions. She started asking questions. Where had all the family's assets gone? What hadn't been disclosed? And most importantly, where had her mother Mirella actually lived when she died in 2019? This last question became the linchpin of everything. Mirella had officially been registered as a resident of Switzerland. Under Swiss law, the inheritance agreements Margarita had signed, including waiving her rights to her mother's estate, were valid. But under Italian law, such agreements aren't enforceable. If Mirella had actually been living in Italy, not Switzerland, then everything changed. Margarita filed lawsuits. She claimed her mother's Swiss residence was fictitious, that Mirella had actually lived in Italy, and the family had created false documents to make it appear otherwise. She pointed to Mirella's book, published by Adelphi, which had been altered after the fact to include references to her life in Switzerland. She noted that Gianni Agnelli's beloved dogs had been transferred to someone other than Mirella after his death, possibly to avoid suggesting Mirella lived where the dogs lived. The Italian tax authorities got involved. If Mirella had been living in Italy, substantial inheritance taxes would be owed. In 2022, prosecutors opened a criminal investigation into alleged tax fraud. They claimed the Elkann siblings, John, Larpo and Ginevra, had used fictitious trusts in Bermuda and fake donations to avoid paying hundreds of millions in taxes. Assets worth €74.8 million were seized. The prosecutor alleged that valuable paintings by Bacon, De Chirico and Warhol, along with jewellery worth millions, had been transferred through fake donations that would never have been legal in Italy. John Elkann faced charges of tax fraud. In September 2025, a plea deal was reached. John Elkann agreed to 1 year of community service and, along with his siblings, paid €183 million to the Italian Revenue Agency. The criminal case was closed without an admission of guilt, as is standard under Italian law. But the civil lawsuit between Margarita and her 3 eldest children continues. In September 2025, Margarita's lawyers produced a previously undisclosed handwritten will from Gianni Agnelli, dated January 20th, 1998. This document appeared to leave Gianni's 25% stake in Decembre to his son Edoardo, not to John Elkann, as the 1996 letter had indicated. Since Edoardo had died in 2000 before Gianni passed away in 2003, that stake should have gone to Edoardo's heirs according to Margarita's argument, namely Margarita herself and Mirella. Instead, Mirella had donated that stake to John, giving him majority control. Margarita's lawyers argued that this proved Gianni's final wishes had been betrayed, that the entire ownership structure of Decembre and therefore Exor, and therefore the control of billions in assets should be reconsidered. John's lawyers countered that the 2004 settlement was final and binding, that Margarita had made her choice and couldn't now undo it. The battle continues in Turin's civil courts. Billions of dollars hang in the balance. The Stellantis empire, Ferrari, Juventus, everything the Agnellis built over more than a century could potentially be redistributed. And at the heart of it is a mother suing her own children for what she believes is rightfully hers and her 5 other children's inheritance. Lapo, the wild heir. While John embodied the serious, responsible side of the family and Ginevra pursued filmmaking away from the spotlight, Lapo Elkan represented something else entirely. Born in 1977, Lapo was the middle child, and from the beginning, he lived life on his own terms. Lapo started his career the traditional Agnelli way, working under a false name on the Piaggio assembly line in 1994. He wanted to understand the business from the ground up. He even participated in a strike to demand better working conditions, a remarkable move for someone who'd one day be worth hundreds of millions. In 2001, he worked as a personal assistant to Henry Kissinger. He worked in marketing for Ferrari and Maserati. He had the pedigree, the connections, the education. But Lapo also had demons. In 2005, just 2 years after his grandfather's death, Lapo was found unconscious in a Turin apartment. He'd taken too much cocaine and heroin. Paramedics rushed him to the hospital where he was placed in a medically induced coma. The scandal was enormous. Headlines screamed about the Fiat heir found in a compromising situation. Lapo recovered, but doctors said he'd come terrifyingly close to not making it. After this incident, Lapo stepped down from his positions at Fiat. Lapo founded Italia Indipendent in 2007, a design company focused on eyewear made from carbon fibre. He also created Garage Italia, a custom car design company. His Instagram became a testament to his lifestyle: exotic cars, celebrity friends, fashion week parties. He seemed determined to live every day at maximum intensity. But the darkness kept returning. In 2016, during Thanksgiving weekend, Lapo flew to New York. He spent 2 days with an escort inside a Manhattan housing project, consuming alcohol, marijuana, and cocaine. When their money ran out, Lapo came up with a plan. He called his family claiming he'd been kidnapped and needed $10,000 to secure his release. His family immediately contacted police. Officers investigated and quickly realized something was off. Lapo had called from his own cell phone. He'd been posting on social media throughout the supposed kidnapping, including photos of Steve McQueen with captions about speed and never stopping. Police arrested both Lapo and the escort, though charges against the escort were dropped when it became clear Lapo had fabricated the entire story. Lapo was charged with filing a false police report, a misdemeanor. Italia Indipendent stock plummeted on the news. Family members were reportedly fed up with Lapo's behavior, his cycle of substance issues and scandals. Lapo entered rehab again. He emerged seemingly committed to change, but in 2020, he was stopped by police twice in one day. First for speeding in a Ferrari, then a few hours later when officers found him in possession of several grams of cocaine. Through it all, Lapo has remained defiant. He's spoken openly about his struggles, calling them part of his journey. He's continued his business ventures with varying degrees of success. And he's remained a board member of Ferrari, still connected to the family empire even as his personal life has spiraled. Lapo represents something the Agnelli family has never quite known how to handle: a visible public reminder that immense wealth doesn't guarantee happiness, that privilege comes with its own forms of suffering, and that no amount of money can fix what's broken inside a person. The dynasty's future. Today, John Elkann, at 48 years old, sits at the helm of one of Europe's largest business empires. As CEO of Exor and chairman of both Stellantis and Ferrari, He controls assets worth tens of billions. He merged Fiat with Chrysler in 2014, saving the American automaker from collapse and creating a transatlantic powerhouse. In 2021, he oversaw the merger with PSA Group to create Stellantis, which now produces nearly 8 million vehicles annually across 14 automotive brands, including Fiat, Chrysler, Jeep, Peugeot, and Citroën. Under John's leadership, the family has diversified beyond automobiles. Exor holds significant stakes in CNH Industrial, the truck manufacturer Iveco, electronics giant Philips, and fashion house Christian Louboutin. They own The Economist magazine and control much of Italy's print media through the Gedi Publishing Group. They still own Juventus Football Club, though the team has faced financial and sporting challenges in recent years. John is married with 3 children. He's known for being reserved, calculated, the opposite of his grandfather's flashy charm. He rarely gives interviews. He works behind the scenes, making strategic decisions that move billions. He's proven himself a capable steward of the empire Gianni entrusted to him. But the legal battles with his mother threaten everything. If Margherita succeeds in her lawsuits, if Italian courts rule that the inheritance agreements were invalid, the entire structure of control could collapse. Margherita wants equality for all her 8 children, not just the 3 from her first marriage. She wants her 5 children from her second marriage to have their rightful share of what their grandfather built. The Agnelli family has always been compared to other dynastic families. The Kennedys in America, the British royal family. Like those families, they've experienced the price of privilege. Plane crashes, mysterious deaths, mental illness, scandals, addiction, and now a multi-billion-dollar legal war that shows no signs of ending. The extended Agnelli family today consists of approximately 200 members. Most live quiet lives far from the headlines. But those at the centre, those who control the empire, remain locked in a battle that their great-grandfather Giovanni could never have imagined when he invested $400 in a small automobile company in 1899. The cost of dynasty. Looking back over more than a century of Agnelli history, patterns emerge. Giovanni's son, Edoardo, died young in a plane crash. Edoardo's wife, Virginia, died in a car accident. Gianni's brother, Giorgio, struggled with mental illness and passed away at 35. Gianni's nephew, Giovanni Alberto, being groomed to lead Fiat, died of cancer at 33 in 1997, forcing Gianni to turn to his grandson, John. Gianni's son, Edoardo, the spiritual seeker, died under mysterious circumstances under a bridge at 46. The tragedies aren't limited to death. Lapo's very public struggles with substances and scandalous incidents have made him a tabloid fixture. The inheritance war between Margherita and her children has exposed family secrets, tax schemes, and the lengths to which the wealthy will go to protect their fortunes. Sisters and brothers have testified against each other. Mothers have sued sons. The dynasty that once seemed unshakable is revealing all its fractures. The question that haunts the Agnelli story is whether such immense wealth and power can ever be worth what it costs. Giovanni built Fiat into an empire, but he had to make compromises with fascism to survive. Gianni lived a life of elegance and influence, but he lost his brother to mental illness and his son to circumstances that may never be fully understood. He passed over his own daughter to give control to his grandson, creating a rift that has lasted more than 2 decades. John Elkann has wealth beyond measure, but he spent years in courtrooms defending against accusations from his own mother. Lapo has fame and fortune, but he's nearly died multiple times and has faced arrest on multiple continents. Margherita had 1.2 billion euros, but she believes she was cheated out of billions more and has been fighting her own children for 20 years. The Fiat empire continues. Stellantis produces millions of cars each year. Ferrari remains one of the most prestigious brands in the world. Juventus still fills stadiums. The Agnelli name still commands respect in Italy and beyond. But the human cost of maintaining that empire, of trying to control billions across generations, has been staggering. The workers at Fiat's factories, the millions of families who've driven Fiat 500s, the football fans who've cheered for Juventus, they see the Agnelli success story. They see innovation, quality, national pride, and those things are real. Giovanni Agnelli and his descendants genuinely did help build modern Italy, did create products that improved people's lives, did push the boundaries of automotive engineering. But inside the family, there's a different story, one of immense pressure, of expectations that crush rather than elevate, of relationships warped by money and control, of tragedies that keep repeating in new forms across the decades. The Agnelli family story is far from over. The legal battles continue in Turin. John Elkann still leads Exor, making decisions that affect hundreds of thousands of employees and millions of shareholders. Lapo continues his unpredictable journey through scandals and business ventures. Margherita continues fighting for what she believes her father owed her and her children. More than 125 years after Giovanni Agnelli co-founded Fiat, the dynasty he started remains one of Europe's most powerful, but it's also one of the most troubled. The cars are beautiful, the balance sheet's impressive, the influence undeniable. Yet the human beings at the centre of it all have paid prices that no amount of money could ever justify. They built an empire, and in many ways, the empire built them, shaped them, sometimes destroyed them. The Agnelli family is Italy's richest dynasty, but they're also a cautionary tale about what happens when wealth and power become more important than the people who hold them. The story continues. More chapters will be written, more court cases will be filed, more secrets will emerge, and the world will keep watching, fascinated by this family that has so much, and yet, in the ways that matter most, seems to have lost something essential along the way. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.